This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Esop. You are listening to our Nourish and Flourish conversation. NGO Self-Care explores new ways of doing things. It reflects on challenges specific to the sector or provides inspiration, filling up our tanks, not just as staff but as people. So today I want to explore questions, ideas and new ways of doing things when it comes to working with government. I think a bit of context is needed for this conversation. History has shown us that crisis drives innovation, and during 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, civil society has been at the forefront, filling a gap in the delivery of social services. As the Chief Executive Officer of DGMT wrote in his book, Harnessing the Thunder, civil society rose to the challenge and did just that. When civil society moved quickly to provide food, shelter, and personal protective equipment, they demonstrated agility, energy, and the mobilizing power of the sector. We saw how different things could be when government and the private sector embraced the solutions that civil society had to offer. With this in mind, I want to better understand how to improve this relationship. I ask, rather simplistically, is there a sweet spot when working with government? My first guest is Professor Shafika Isaacs. She is a digital learning specialist and associate professor of practice at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Isaacs is joined by DGMT's Director of Strategic Operations, Senzo Tlhope, who has years of experience engaging with various government departments, most recently working on the Presidential Employment Stimulus. Now, based on their depth of experience of working with government to drive innovation, whether it be in digital learning and ICT or social spending, I'm bound to learn a lot from this conversation. So without further ado, let's get started. Shafika, perhaps you can kick us off with a framing of the challenge as you see it when civil society attempts to position itself as an equal partner with government and business. What historical, political, and structural dynamics come into play?
We now need to pose different kinds of questions in terms of how best do we tackle the complexity of poverty, unemployment, degradation, the psychosocial challenges in the way it's manifesting now, that we need to think differently about how we wage those battles. And the old categories of partnerships with civil society, business, and government has actually led us to this place. Maybe we need to reconsider how we position social formations and build unity around very clear social justice objectives in far more dynamic ways than we have done before. I'm not finding it helpful anymore to draw this broad distinction between government, civil society, and business, and looking at how we can explore civil society as an equal partner to government. I think the issues are a lot more complex, and I think we need to reframe the way we understand the nature of the social justice, environmental justice, embodied justice issues, and the way they are surfacing in our society at the moment in such complex and alarming ways that it leaves many of us overwhelmed. And so my invitation is, can we look at how we need to be reframing the conversation in terms of what kinds of social formations do we need now to advance a far more formidable social justice challenge? And what does that look like? So that's my invitation to this conversation.
While you were speaking, Senzo was jotting down some of his thoughts, and I want to give him the opportunity to perhaps respond to your invitation to reframe these three broad categories of government, civil society, and the private sector before we can even talk about partnerships and equal partnerships and everyone having an equal seat at the table. Senzo?
I think the conversation should be based on recognizing that the work we have to do as South Africa, specifically in our context, is reimagining terms of recognition. And I think if we think about the old way of categorizing, is that pre-1994, it was such a clear cut in that there was a role for civil society which was to play the role of providing last mile service deliveries to communities that could not get specific social welfare benefits and other support. The state was seen as, in fact, as counterproductive to the livelihood and development of people. And I think the transition from the pre-1994 government to the government we have today there was for at least 5 to 10 years a period of wonder of if ever, or if there is an opportunity or a role for civil society, because the idea and the belief was that the state will be both the luminary, holder of the vision for our people, will equally be the manager to implement and deliver programs and services to people and to communities. Obviously, decades in, we have seen that is not true and possible. So, when it comes to categories, to my mind, I think the categorizing of sectors is immaterial, as much as we should be speaking about roles and attributes that cross these traditional categories of categorizing South Africa's sectors. In that, I think the most simpler way of putting it, at least in my head, is that in any society, we need luminaries, ideators, thinkers, visionaries, writers, people who are holding the light and the mantle of hope and possibility. On that very same moment in time and period, you equally need entrepreneurs, innovators, people who are finding ways of solving immediate issues, creating a sense of possibility through actions. But in that very same period in time, you need effective, capable managers, people who are thinking about deployment of resources and support for the betterment of all. In that same breath, you equally need organizers. You need organizers who are thinking around logistical arrangements of ensuring that a child in Kunu, a child in Kofimbaba, in Popoyi, in Kwadukuza, they will get the same benefits of care and service that in relation to a child in Sandton or Cape Town. We equally need networkers, people who are really thinking around the interface of different like and unlike-minded partners, who are leveraging those networks to create the neural effect that seeks to connect what might be, at the face value, looks disconnected. And this, what it means, I think, for all of us is that the idea that if you work for civil society, that you are holier than thou, and that you know the solutions to problems, and that you've got this figured out, should end right here, right now. The idea that civil servants are inept, incompetent, or incapable should stop right here, right now. The idea that businesses are efficient and incompetent and all of that should stop here, right now. We should be looking at what I was talking about earlier around how do we identify those attributes across these traditional categories to start to redefine the terms of recognition that will build the pathway for change that we need in this country.
Senzo, I want to ask you, what are some of the drawbacks of a relationship between the category of government and the category of civil society as we know it today, where civil society is largely considered to be just a service provider or last mile provider, as you said in your previous response, rather than an innovation partner?
I do think the role that civil society also plays, and that is critical, is that because we can pilot, we can test, we can do the R&D work, that the luxury the state does not have. Because the state, they have three things they're always looking for, and I appreciate that iron triangle they always have to balance. The state is always thinking about scale. We're talking millions of people who do not get that benefit. B, affordability. It can't be a very high per capita cost because we can't afford it. The third part is quality. So if you the state is always looking for something of that instrument that is high quality, low in price, and reaches millions of people. That's what the state is looking for. Civil society, whether you include funders in that mix and churches, we can never reach that level of infrastructure and capability. What we can do is do the early work, the formative work of research and development and prototyping and piloting ideas with that in mind, often solution that meets that iron triangle requirement. And that changes the relationship in its head, in that civil society becomes the groundswell for innovating, for publicly innovating for the betterment of the public good that we are seeking to strive and achieve. And that positions civil society as a thought leader, as an idea generator, as an entrepreneurial partner with the state, and also a risk taker with a much higher risk appetite than the state might or might not have.
Thanks, Enzo. I'm going to take the conversation in a slightly different direction to try and answer this simplistic question that I've posed. Is there a sweet spot to working with government? As we are having this conversation, a video has been making the rounds of a minister yelling at someone at a community meeting. The man in question is with the Action Society, a public benefit organization that has been around since about 2019. When we see those types of negative engagements in the public space, are we dealing with a trust deficit? And I want to throw this question to both Shafika and Senzo.
I think, to me, when it's trust, I really think we need to sit and think hard what we mean by trust. And trust is not an event. Trust is a process, a series of events that accumulates over time and reflects in itself in the manner in which you've just described, Rahima, in relation to the minister in question and the activists who they were engaging at a public event. But I also think trust can be best understood in more on an academic side, is in a way that you understand relative deprivation. It's a concept I came across in political science. And what relative deprivation is that when people enter into contracts with an individual, with a leader, with a community, with the state, is that there's a social contract between the two that gives one legitimacy. But that legitimacy does not come from a blank check. There is an expectation that something will happen. And when that thing does not happen, and does not happen over time, it gets to a point where the relationship is so broken that the mistrust has become the foundation of which that relationship exists.
Shafika, go ahead.
What we need is a capable state. And we've been debating our status has become so hamstrung and incapable. Some people feel it's a failed state. I don't think so. But we also need to ensure that we build the formations that can also hold the state accountable. And we've seen more of that, fortunately, in South Africa as a very dynamic country that comes from a very strong mass mobilization culture for many, many centuries, actually. And so it really is about how then do we tap into that. And so I don't think that if there is a sweet spot, I think it's probably a case of exploring what the possibilities are to shift the power imbalance, to challenge head-on abuses of power, and to look at how maybe the sweet spot is the kinds of activities that would lead to building senses and building structures of empowering communities who are most marginalized, most under-resourced, most excluded. And what that looks like, I think we've got perhaps some examples of that in the country at a very micro level, and not necessarily in a sort of a systematized way. But I think that's again, it's a reframing conversation, and we are wanting to still make sense of what this is that's going on and what is it that we need to do. And these kinds of conversations are quite useful in helping us make sense of it in that way.
Shafiqa, now that we've framed the dynamics shaping this relationship, let's talk about your experience working on the remote and digital learning portfolio with the National Education Collaboration Trust. That's NECT, which, if our listeners don't know, is the organization set up to strengthen partnerships between civil society and government in the basic education sector.
I cannot speak on behalf of the NECT because I don't work for the NECT. The NECT has asked me to support and lead their work in remote and digital learning in terms of designing an effective response to the COVID crisis and the crisis of learning continuity and the disruption in education that we were confronted with, that was catalyzed by the COVID pandemic. And so my engagement in the NECT was quite specific. But having said that, what I appreciated was also the moment. So, the COVID moment, certainly in the first phase, under lockdown level 5, and then we obviously progressed to other levels of lockdown subsequently. But there was a moment when we could see the power of the state to mobilize the whole of society around a very clearly defined objective. And in this case, it was to ensure that all children in our schooling system, no matter where they are, can have access to learning resources so that they can continue learning. And that we mobilize the widest possible range of societies, social formations, community-based organizations, civil society organizations, trade unions, churches, etc., families, mothers and fathers and gogos. And it was quite an inspiring moment to see that I've experienced, where through the NECT being tasked with playing the implementation role, the design and implementation role in partnership with the state, recognizing that the state itself and government and the department did not have the capacity to run large-scale initiatives by themselves, and they had to have structures that could mobilize the widest possible formations in society around a very particular agenda, in support also of what the state was trying to do, what government was trying to do, and that is to ensure that there's learning continuity for every child and for every family. And so in the NECT, given the space that the NECT is also given since its inception to mobilize partnerships, to build connections. NECT often says that they are the nets in connection in terms of mobilizing the widest possible network. And that was actually what we ended up doing in the NECT, is look at how we can encourage everybody who are engaged, to have resources in remote and digital learning, to come to the party so that we can look at how best you can play a role and contribute towards this objective to promote quality learning continuity for everybody, using the affordances of technologies at the low end, like television and radio, to high end, from YouTube to mobile applications, etc. We were able to mobilize big business to make available resources such as zero rating, sometimes through struggles by civil society. It wasn't easily won victories, but some of it was also an incredible goodwill that the partnership between the NECT government and a wide range of organizations and businesses were able to forge at that moment. Incredible goodwill, to the extent, and here for me was the bit that was most inspiring, was that through the NECT, we were also able to mobilize competitors, people who are competing for market capture and so on, that they were prepared to work together in the interest of the national public good. And for me, that says that when we have strong political will, when we have strong leadership, and we can show how we can mobilize contending forces in the interest of the national public good, it is possible.
Thanks, Shafika. Senzo, how do we capitalize on that COVID moment and the energy and momentum of the COVID moment?
I also had my own fair share, Rahima, of working with the states during the time of, I guess, the COVID pandemic at its height, specifically working on the ECD stimulus with the National Department of Social Development. Obviously, I was not working alone. I was representing DGMT in it. Project management team that's comprised of NDSD, civil society partners from Impande, from Nelson Mandela Foundation, and others were in the room. I'm mentioning names here because DGMT alone was not the thing that made it work. And obviously, to my mind, I think what was really interesting was obviously two funders, which in this instance was Elma Philanthropies and DGMT coming together to say, how might we support the states to move quickly by providing financial resources to unlock a R500 million worth of money that was to benefit 100,000 ECD practitioners. That to me was exciting way of like, yes, we have R500 million, we need to move quickly. We have 10, 15 million rand. How do we work together? The second one, which I think is important, specifically in the ECD, the early childhood development space, was because the sector is so informal that the state more or less has no direct relationship with the sector. They did not know the extent to which it's informal and who the informal was and how to communicate and engage with the informal. Even if the benefits, the ECD Relief Fund was meant to benefit them. And then four, having to, I guess, be in a space where, yes, I want to support, but the instruments to support, they are not designed for the informal economy of ECD provisioning of early learning. So, and because one, it's created a zone of possibilities that everyone was excited around the table. But now having to find the right instruments and solutions to do it that are somehow compliant with the Public Finance Managing Act, which is dated, and many other regulations, was probably the most interesting case study that I took away, that I think it's something we need to reflect as a country, to really look into the gains of COVID in the context of all the loss we experienced. There were some wins in some of the laws that were suspended, in some of the ways of working that was introduced, that I think we should build from it moving forward.
Thanks, Enzo. What I gathered from listening to that is that it's important for civil society to understand not only the culture of government, but also the rules of government in order to be able to work with government more effectively. I want to bring it back to you, Shafika. What are some of the key ingredients for strengthening a working relationship or a partnership between civil society and government? If you are being asked to synthesize your own learnings into the most important takeaways, what would they be?
What I found valuable is not being so blatantly dismissive of people who work in government. As you know, some of my colleagues, we always debate those issues, and there's sort of that a sense as well. When my experience has been that there are some really good people who stick it out through thick and thin, despite all the challenges of working with government, and so really building those relationships. Especially with those colleagues who have positions where they can make some decisions, and being quite strategic about that, I think has proven to be very useful, to the extent that they also feel that they are supported, that one can engage with them in a way that you can have safe space conversations. So that there's a sense that they are also being held. And that, I think, is part of a culture of care and compassion, actually, and the building of relationships that requires the building of trust. But the care and compassion and the sense of support, that is focused on delivering the goods, delivering the work that needs to be done so that the services are being delivered to the people. That's quite important. The other is building leadership and engaging with those who have decision-making powers, with a sense of assertion as well, and constantly engaging and putting forward possibilities for how a given situation can be led, So I think basically what I'm saying is really about having a sense of agency in creating spaces that could make things work. But that does mean that you have a sense of your own power and your own ability to raise issues that can then encourage a sense of engagement. And I still want to believe that we can create those spaces in any given situation. I do still want to believe that the heart of being South African and African is that there is this thing that drives us. You can give it various names, but this thing about working and serving in the interests of the people, in the national interest, in the interests of ordinary working people. There is something there that is still in our DNA. With all the shenanigans going on, we lose sight of that is still there within each of us, in government, in the different civil society organizations, etc., in South Africa and across the African continent. And I think that is what we need to hone in on. It's appealing to our inner sensibilities, appealing to our sense of compassion and care and love. Maybe it is really about building a compassionate society, building and engaging in pedagogies of care. And I think that when we begin to recreate and reframe and reorganize ourselves, that could be the thing that unites us. The desire to have a compassionate and build a compassionate society and a compassionate culture. And that does begin with love. That's a lovely way to end, in the name of love.
I think so. Senzo, I'm going to give you an opportunity to just briefly reflect on knowing what you know, having experienced what you've experienced. What would you do differently in your engagement with government?
I think what I would probably do differently is pausing for a second, to really have an opportunity to build the relationship with the people you are working with. Because I was working under such a time, we were all, not just me, we were working in such a time-sensitive, high-pressure environment that when I look back, there were smaller things that we overlooked that created what might have been a much more difficult process to lead. And I think if I was to do anything different, is to see the other people who were in the room just for purely who they are as a human being, not who they are as a civil servant, as a politician, as something else. Just purely to see Rahima for the human being she is before moving into engaging about the work. And I think that is something I experienced towards the end of the project. And I think all of us, the more we did that, the more we realized, how did we miss that? How did we miss that? Because people were much more flexible. They were much more engaging. They were much more open the moment they knew who Senzo is. And who Senzo is not an individual. It's a community. It's a family. It's my parents. And the moment they bring their stories into a conversation, then people start shifting perspective about who they think you might or might not be. Because they saw in my soul, in my heart, who and what I am and stand for. And that the DGMT hat I was wearing, which obviously had targets and things to be achieved, was just a mechanism, an instrument to achieve a goal. And I think the point I'm making is the relationship matters as much as the work matters. And probably if I was to go back, I will build the relationship from the ground up.
I want to use this opportunity to thank both my speakers. I began this conversation by asking, is there a sweet spot to working with government? And let's be frank, much of this conversation is premised on the notion that finding that sweet spot requires looking for opportunities and synergies in civil society's interactions with government. But we are engaging with a state hobbled by corruption and weak accountability measures. So for many civil society organizations, particularly those challenging the state, the sweet spot may involve a sustained effort to really transform the state, to address challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. And perhaps a conversation for another day is discussing other forms of engagement that seek to transform the state and the role of civil society in unlocking and leveraging informal socio-economic networks to do just that. And now, over to you. Those listening to this podcast today, using what you have heard, you can try this reflective exercise with your colleagues. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website, learninglunch.dgmt.co.za. What are some of the ways in which government and civil society can build a relationship of mutual respect? What should be included in a social compact that includes government, civil society, and business? And in your own experience, what are some of the explicit and implicit rules of engagement between civil society and government? You've been listening to the Nourish and Flourish conversation with me, Rahima Esop. Until next time.